Let's take a deep dive into genre. This week in the course lecture, we explore genres as they relate to the narrative elements that we've learned about. We also discuss how those narrative elements are construed to appeal to certain audiences. In this video, we're going to go over the concept of tropes and the way those tropes are typically tied to specific genres in a way that also influence the way narrative elements are used in narrative development. I like to start with the detective genre because it's a personal favorite and a fan favorite. Along the side column here you see a list of tropes. The first one, victim who is the villain, pertains to a situation wherein which a person is pretending to have been victimized, but they are in actuality the culprit. But it also pertains to situations wherein which the person who is harmed or killed is in some way or another unsavory and thusly provides many people with the motive to harm them. For a death that's not quite what it seems, this is typically a situation wherein which a death has either been staged or the events of the death, the circumstances surrounding it, are being misinterpreted by our detective. So many motives, so little time actually ties to the victim who is the villain trope, insofar as if the victim is also the sort of person that people would seek revenge against, that creates circumstances wherein which there are potentially multiple people who are guilty of the crime. The fake clues and mind games trope comes into play in a detective narrative whenever there is someone who is working in opposition to the detective. There can be many different reasons why this may be happening. One that is most popular to consider comes into play in the Sherlock story with his nemesis Moriarty, where in which the enemy, or the villain in that case, happens to be as intelligent as the detective and wants to test their skills. The big reveal is a standard moment in most detective narratives where in which the detective will relay all of the clues they gathered and also share the conclusion that they've drawn based on those clues. You might be wondering, how does a creative decide which tropes to use? That's a good question. That's going to come down to the target audience. When we're thinking about the target audience, we're considering the age, the era wherein which the people were born, where they grew up, what other media they tend to like. Having this information is typically going to determine how narrative elements and tropes are employed within the genre that you're working in. When we're thinking about how the specific tropes are selected, we have to think more about what the audience is expecting. In order to do that, we have to consider their conditioned preferences. By conditioned preferences, what we mean are the preferences that you may have developed by virtue of the things that society insists that you prefer. This is where thought processes like girls like this and boys like that come into play. It's not going to apply to everyone, but there is, by virtue of the way society is structured, a psychological component to those conditioned preferences. Other things to consider would be alternative preferences, which usually but not always run contrary to the conditioned preferences or specifically subvert them. Another thing to consider when it comes to determining what the audience may want to see is the fact that they oftentimes have told you by virtue of surveys or social media engagements. With that information in hand regarding target audiences, let's go ahead and explore more genres and their relations to specific tropes. A genre that is related to a previous genre we just reviewed, detective, is the crime genre. This is oftentimes developed around a situation in which, of course, a crime has occurred, but focused on the events from the angle of the criminal themselves. The first trope we have listed here, a difficult set of circumstances, pertains to a reason why a person may choose to commit a crime. There could be economic circumstances, someone could perhaps have come down with a serious illness and they need help, and the criminal can only provide that help if they break the law. Those sorts of things tend to be applied at times whenever we're meant to see the criminal as someone who is relatable or generally likable. The attempt to reform is another trope that's applied whenever we're meant to see the criminal as relatable or potentially likable. Within the attempt to reform, we may see that the character is, at the beginning of the story, making a shift towards a more positive, by the book, straight laced lifestyle, and, and finding that they are challenged to do so. Another way that attempt to reform narrative can show up for us is we might actually see a character on the end of the attempt to reform spectrum, where in which they've fully established themselves as a hardworking citizen of whatever country they occupy. They're not breaking any rules or laws, but, and this is attached to the previous trope mentioned, a circumstance may present itself that brings them back into their criminal activities. One of those circumstances could be just a basic invitation to devolve. This could be a sense of boredom for the main character, if the main character is a criminal, or this could be a specific invitation from someone who is from their past, either in the form of a friendly connection or in the form of blackmail. Whenever we have a crime drama where in which we're focusing on the perspective of the criminal, you will have increasingly high stakes where in which the criminal has to make choices that can further destabilize either the plans that they have to break the law or the life that they have outside of that specific criminal activity. Everything goes wrong, or the runaway train situation, is attached to the increasingly high stakes, insofar as if you find that the character is coming against more and more and more challenging circumstances that cannot be easily resolved, it's almost as if the entire situation has slipped outside of their control, which of course threatens the stability of their lives, all of the hard work that they may have put into developing the plan for the crime they're attempting to commit, but also all the hard work that they may have put into the life that they've tried to build outside of that crime or outside of their criminal activities. Another genre that is fairly heavy and highly recognizable by virtue of its tropes is horror. One of the things we can almost always expect to see within a horror is an abandoned location, haunted house, for example. And this is a space where in which the unknown is allowed to thrive, more or less without any sort of opposition. In addition to the abandoned location, we also have a series of bad decisions or one crucial bad decision. A crucial bad decision could potentially be splitting up if you're in a group, but that could also be the first of a series of bad decisions that leads one or more of the people in the film towards doom and destruction. An undefeatable foe is oftentimes the specific enemy that we're dealing with in a horror narrative, regardless of whatever their origin may be. If they are human, preternatural, or supernatural, they still have this undefeatable quality by virtue of the fact that the heroes or the protagonists in the narrative don't know anything about them or don't know enough about them to defeat them. Indirect encounters that lead to the monster reveal are also standard in the creation of tension within the horror narrative. So you can have maybe half, maybe even over half of a film where in which you don't get one clear direct look at the enemy that you're facing. And this helps sort of build the tension not just for you and the audience, but also for the characters in the film, increasing their level of fear, which also increases the likelihood that they would potentially make bad decisions, right? Which plays into the way the narrative plays out. Additionally, whenever you have a horror narrative, you also have the survivor, either the lone survivor or two or three survivors. And these are often people who are marked by the specific trauma or tragedy that they experience, but they are also more than likely inclined to be the stars of any sequels that may happen, where in which the villain returns to continue the work they began in the previous movie. Some common tropes for war are military lineage, David and Goliath odds, the make or break battle or obstacle, fictive kin, which, if you've not heard that term before, refers to a family unit that you establish by virtue of just existing amongst each other and choosing to be familiar with each other, and larger than life regrets. When we're referring to military lineage, this is a situation where which you have a character or several characters who are second and third generation in whatever body of the military that they occupy. So they can be second and third generation Navy, second and third generation Army, and so on. And with that comes a certain amount of pressure to perform a certain way, to accomplish what previous generations, a father or a grandfather or uncle accomplished. And that pressure can cause different behavioral traits or choices within the character. When we're talking about David and Goliath odds, that's a situation where in which you have a character or a set of characters who are not as well equipped as their opposition or as their specific enemies. For the make or break battle or obstacle, typically you would find this within the context of a war film that has historical leaning or historical focus, war in which everything is sort of centered around one specific battle. In order to win this war, we have to win this one battle. In order to win this battle, we have to disrupt this social structure. In order to make our way to the center of the town to rescue the citizens, we have to tear down this wall. It's a conflict pinpoint within the narrative where in which this one thing has to happen in order for everything to go well beyond that point. Fictive kin is fairly standard in a war narrative. By virtue of the concept of trauma bonding, there's an experience that soldiers have with each other or around each other that only they can understand. And so a familial bond forms by virtue of that shared experience. Larger than life regrets can manifest in several different ways within a war narrative. You can have a situation where in which someone regrets joining the military because they realize that they may not survive their time away from home, may not be able to return to their spouse, may not be able to see their children grow up. Another way that larger than life regrets tend to manifest can be situations where in which someone makes a decision within the context of their time in war that has long-term lasting effects on their psyche or on their sense of a moral compass. In an adventure narrative, more often than not, what we're navigating through is the hero's journey. And this is the foundation for a handful of other genres. So we're going to take some time now to sort of deviate and take a look at the hero's journey, just for the sake of orienting ourselves to how that operates within the context of narrative tropes. The hero's journey within itself, of course, is a collection of universal tropes. Oftentimes in the hero's journey, how it begins is with a call to adventure. This can manifest in any way. You'll notice it within any story. It can be a literal call, a phone call. It can be a dream if you're dealing perhaps in the fantasy narrative space. After the call to adventure, we come to a point called the threshold, where in which a character is invited outside of their norm, invited to step outside what they have always experienced up to that point and engage with a different aspect of life, which brings about new challenges that help them to test their sense of self, test their knowledge, test their strength, and develop new strengths, a new sense of self, and new knowledge. Beyond that point, we have temptation. Temptation can vary. It can mean a lot of different things for a lot of different characters. There could be the temptation to quit, to turn around, to go back home. There can be the temptation to completely shed one's morality and pursue a different sort of lifestyle outside of the hero's journey. There can be the temptation to stay where they are, right? If you think about perhaps the Odyssey and the Isle of Lotus Eaters, where in which the temptation was just to stay in absolute bliss instead of going back home. To clear temptation, to pass through it, to show your strength, is to enter a stage of death and rebirth wherein which you are ultimately abjectly changed. So this happens along the hero's journey, which can then take them into transformation. And through that process of transformation comes a new perspective, wherein which they identify ways that they may have been weak or less than previously. And with that knowledge, they go into a state of atonement. Atonement can happen within completely, just reconnecting with the idea of what a person wants to be and realigning themselves to how they want to behave in life, or it can happen externally. It can be having to commit to apologizing to someone, having to commit to shifting the way you behave towards someone. And all of these things can be actualized in the process of returning to home. Now, we talk a little bit about the concept of recursive cycles. When we're talking about the writing cycle, you'll note that the hero's journey is a circle. And given the fact that it is a circle, it is possible for a hero, one specific hero, to take multiple turns around this journey, where in which they cross new thresholds, encounter different challenges, encounter different temptations, and so on and so on. And this is especially important to keep in mind again when we're talking about adventure and the genres that are quite similar to it or are attached to it, like fantasy, for example. When we're dealing with fantasy, more often than not, we have the presence of a mystical place or people, something outside of the quote-unquote norm. This might be outside of the norm for the character, but it could be normal for the character and just outside of the norm for the people in the audience. We also, within the context of a fantasy narrative, have magic of some sort. This can be magic in the traditional way that we all understand it, the Harry Potter way, the abracadabra way, or this can be magic within the context of a narrative like Avatar: The Last Airbender, where in which they have a sort of enhanced martial art that allows them to bend elements. It's not considered magic in the traditional sense. It may be magical to us in the world that we exist in, where such a thing is not possible, but it's not considered magic within the narrative. That still counts as a fantasy trope. Additionally, you can have a set of specific skills that are split across two or more characters. Typically within a fantasy, a character is not usually always by themselves. Even if they are traveling alone, they more often than not will come across a person to help them address one specific challenge or one specific battle, and that person will have strengths or skill sets that the main character themselves does not have. If a main character is traveling in a group, then you will find that throughout that group, from person to person, is a collection of skills that will allow them to defeat any monster or accomplish any task that lies before them. Another thing you may occasionally see happen within a fantasy narrative is quote unquote the one weapon. The one weapon is this end all be all weapon that can either destroy life as you know it in the event that the enemy gets a hold of it, or save everyone from harm and destruction in the event that the protagonist gets their hands on it. When we're dealing with sci-fi narratives, some common tropes happen to be secret laboratory discoveries or intentions, a creation that goes rogue, a new technology that malfunctions, the misuse of tech that destroys progress, and tech advances that make life easier and seemingly more beautiful. When we're thinking about secret laboratories and discoveries or intentions, there are definitely situations where in which the laboratory can be up to no good, i.e., circumstances where in which someone is confiscating materials to build something for themselves, thinking Green Goblin in Spider-Man. But you can also have situations where in which the laboratory is a secret for the sake of the benefit of mankind. For example, in situations where a rare and frightening disease has been found, and so the secret laboratory exists specifically so that disease can be studied away from people so that people cannot be infected by it. Of course, in a sci-fi, the likelihood is that they will be infected by it, but that's another conversation for another time. For the creation that goes rogue, this more often than not pertains to technology, something like AI or any other kind of application of robotics, but it can also apply to situations where there have been enhanced biological creatures, humans or animals, or a situation where in which something or someone has been cloned and is not necessarily behaving in alignment with how they are expected to behave. This is not terribly different from the idea of a new technology malfunctioning. Primarily, when we have a new technology malfunctioning and it's separate from the idea that a creation goes rogue, this has to do with decision making. For a creation to go rogue, it has to make the decision to go rogue. For a new technology to malfunction, that's just a matter of bad luck. So you can have a new technology malfunction in the form of the spaceship is not quite entering hyperdrive, the spaceship's directional tech is not quite working. You can have a situation where in which there is a machine that is meant to turn salt water into fresh water and it doesn't quite successfully do so. A machine that's meant to pull water molecules out of the air, but it is for whatever reason perhaps making a mistake with the chemical composition and the quote unquote water that it has pulled out of the air is actually toxic. Things along those lines. When we're thinking about the misuse of technology that destroys progress, this is going to be a situation where in which there is an item, some sort of creation that actually benefits everyone. There's no wrong that it within itself can do. Someone has to choose to use it incorrectly in order for it to be a problem for everyone. So, for example, the aforementioned tool or machine that can pull water out of the air. If someone decides that they're only going to use it if people pay them inordinate amounts of money for it, in situations where there's no more fresh water left on the planet, that would be considered a misuse of tech that thusly destroys progress. For tech advances that make life easier and seemingly more beautiful, you have to think about utopian, specifically utopian narratives that are based in the future, where in which everyone has a flying car, medicine is easily accessible, there are android nurses that meet you at your front door, things along those lines. When we're dealing within the sport genre, some common tropes are unlikely athlete or underdog team, training, oftentimes in the form of a montage and usually with a mentor, inconvenient or tragic injury, second chance or comeback, and surprise tragedy. So, for the unlikely athlete or underdog team, that's pretty self explanatory. The unlikely athlete is probably someone who has a natural talent for a specific sport but has not actually had any training in it and has not demonstrated prior to that one specific moment within the context of that narrative that they actually have the interest or the ability to engage in that sport. This usually is immediately followed up by some sort of training. Whether the athlete is unlikely or likely, there is typically some sort of training because sports involves training. There's no getting around it. But this is actually a way to engage the audience in an emotional sense because training often comes with a motivational conversation, a series of motivational conversations, and instances of seeing the main character grow and change, which can give a feel good sensation to the audience. For inconvenient or tragic injury, this is more often occurring within the context of an inconvenient injury. So, for a boxer, perhaps a wrist injury, wrist, elbow, jaw, eye, something along those lines. For a soccer player, torn ACL, broken ankle. If the injury happens to be tragic, it could be something entirely out of the gate. Like a football player is struck on the field and their rib accidentally punctures their lung. This could potentially lead to surprise tragedy, but it doesn't always have to. It just creates circumstances wherein which accommodations have to be made in order to suit the circumstances. Someone has to be subbed in, plays have to be changed, and this increases the tension within the story, builds more towards a climax that keeps your audience on the edge of their seat. For a second chance or comeback narrative, this can actually be how a sports story starts, right? Someone's taken a long break away from the sport that they play. Or this can be tied directly to the inconvenient injury mentioned previously, right? You can almost see it playing out in your mind. Movie starts or story starts with the character re-entering training after having had an inconvenient injury that took them out of the sport for a long time. So long, in fact, that they have now become an unlikely athlete or an underdog by virtue of the time they took away from the sport. Surprise tragedy does not always have to involve the characters who are attached to the actual sport. A surprise tragedy can also occur if someone in the main character's family or another team member's family happens to get sick or pass away in a way that is sudden and distracting. The distraction in this case is operating as a quote unquote kind of injury, because not all injuries are external. Some injuries are psychological or emotional, right? So it's again something that's operating as a potential hindrance from the ultimate goal, which is to win. When we are looking at historical fictions, we are operating within a space wherein which we are either entirely making up a full narrative, we pick an era of the past and we just throw any narrative in there that we want, or where we select a character based on a actual person who existed, but we create a fictional life around them. One of the ways that this can be done is with an alternate outcome to an event that we all know about, or an implied risk of alternate outcome. Another application of historical fiction tropes is the subversive iteration of historical figures. That is to say, you have a character who we know existed in the past. We either know via personal account, quote unquote, how they behaved, what they believed, or we know by virtue of what we just assume of people from that era, how they behaved, what they believed, what they accomplished. But with the subversive iteration of them, they are different. They behave outside of the overall expectation based on our historical knowledge. Another trope that we often find in historical fiction is a comedic or convenient anachronism. Anachronisms, just for the sake of making sure that we're all on the same page, are situations or items that exist outside of the time frame in which they actually are meant to exist. A particularly comedic anachronism would be if someone in the year 1800 pulled out an Apple phone. This is not necessarily something that you would see happening in most films. It's almost too obvious of an anachronistic placement. But if you're very, very careful when you're looking at historical fiction narratives or reading historical fiction books, you may find that anachronisms are in place, sometimes by virtue of an accident. Someone overlooked the era of the invention of something, but oftentimes it's there just to sort of poke fun at the fact that liberties are being taken with the overall story. Speaking of fun, when we're looking at comedy, we're talking about something that's lighthearted, silly, or absurd. Some of the common tropes within comedy are bad timing. Bad timing can apply in any sort of way. Someone, perhaps through no fault of their own, leaves their house a little bit later than usual, and as soon as they step at the edge of the sidewalk, someone drives by them, splashes water up on their outfit. Bad timing. A ridiculous end goal is a situation in which the characters wish to accomplish something that's actually really strange and they're putting a lot of time and energy into it, taking it very seriously in a way that is unheard of and confusing if you're not actually attached to the headspace that they occupy, which is going to be the truth, apparently, for everyone in the audience. Another comedy trope is a frustratingly dull character. The person that comes to mind, or rather the entity that comes to mind immediately, is Patrick Star from SpongeBob SquarePants, but also whichever character is the dullest in your opinion in the film Dumb and Dumber. Basically, what this character does is just bring a constant state of confusion and frustration to the narrative. This is going to be funny for people who find that specifically entertaining within itself, but also funny for people who like to see the reactions to that character that they can relate to. There's something cathartic about being able to say, "Oh, are you just an idiot?" within the context of a film, because you can't necessarily say those things in person, in real life. Another trope that we often come across in comedy is the unlikely interruption or obstacle. That is, any instance where in which just the most bizarre thing happens to keep the narrative from proceeding forward. If you ever watch the Mighty Python and the Holy Grail film, the violent, deadly rabbit kind of counts as this unlikely interruption or obstacle because rabbits cannot decimate a battalion of knights. That's not a real thing that can happen, but it is absolutely applicable within the context of a comedy. Anything can happen really in a comedy as long as it's going to make the audience laugh. When we're dealing with romance tropes, the most popular one that I think everyone knows about is the meet cute. The meet cute is a situation wherein which our two characters first meet each other. The aspect that makes it a meet cute is the fact that there is some sort of adorable mix up. Maybe one person grabs the other person's coffee because they both have the same initials, or there's a very cute, quirky, witty exchange between the two characters because they are psychologically matched in a way that lets the audience know that something special can happen between them if they continue to engage with each other. Another thing that could happen would be the unlikely pair. This is not necessarily going to fall in line with the aforementioned couple that's evenly matched and have a interesting witty repartee, at least not at first. These two can't be any more different upon first glance. In fact, they're so different that the highest likelihood is their first few engagements with each other are probably uncomfortable, cantankerous, perhaps they just try everything in their power to avoid each other. But eventually they get beyond that and start to see each other's better qualities, which then results in them potentially liking each other. Common also within a romance is the obstacle. I have it listed here as an obstacle by any other name. Now, this trope can manifest in several different ways. Either it's a person, that is to say that there is a love triangle at play, as overdone as those are, they're still quite popular. Or it could be that one person is about to move to a different city or country. Or it could be that one person is still embroiled in a divorce that's not quite finished. Anything along those lines, anything that presents itself as a hurdle that has to be jumped over in order for the couple to be able to establish a relationship, that's an obstacle. Standard trope within most romances. Another trope that happens within a romance narrative, soulmates. Soulmates. I knew I was supposed to be with you. You knew you were supposed to be with me. Red string of fate around our fingers. Those sorts of circumstances. And these tend to appeal to audiences, actually, not just especially those who are in love. This tends to appeal to audiences generally, either because they want to be able to pick it apart and call it nonsensical, or because they want to be able to hope for it, or because they specifically relate to it. Again, all of that's going to be determined by the specific target audience that the narrative is created for. If soulmates are being included within a romance, the likelihood is that this target audience that's being addressed has a preference for a soulmate narrative. Having gone through all of those genres and the attached tropes, or some of the most um, commonly used attached tropes, you may actually be thinking, I know a lot of these. And that's good, because that's the point. The formulas are consistently applied. Where they differ is in their application, the character interactions, and the situations where they play out. As you progress through the rest of this course, feel free to loop back to this video and use it as a resource when constructing your responses to the projects. Feel free also to loop back after watching any film or reading any book or watching any show that you engage with, just to see how the narrative that you've just explored may or may not employ the tropes that are listed here. Feel free to reach out to your instructor if you have any questions about any of these concepts, or share any thoughts you have about these concepts in the discussion board below.